There is a moment, if you have ever watched a herd of pigs move together across new ground, when the whole group seems to act like a single mind. They do not scatter. They do not wander. They angle all at once toward something they have already decided about, and there is a certainty in them that is almost frightening to see. On the first Tuesday of October in 1889, a young woman named Cora Vass stood at the south fence of 40 acres of blasted hardpan and watched 48 half-dead shoats do exactly that. They poured through the gate she had opened, and they moved, without hesitation, toward the far corner of the property, the corner that every man who had ever looked at this land had pointed to and said was the worst of a bad lot. The red clay there was cracked into plates like a dropped dish. Nothing grew on it but a thin scruff of bitter weed, and the pigs went to it like it owed them something. Cora Vass watched them go, and she thought, in the quiet way she had learned to think since coming to Harlan County alone, that either she had made the best $15 decision of her life or the worst. What she did not yet know was that she had made both. 3 springs earlier is where the real story begins. She had arrived in Harlan County, Kansas, in the spring of 1887, carrying a carpetbag that held everything she owned and a folded deed to 40 acres that her uncle had mailed her from his deathbed, rather than leave to the bank that would otherwise have taken it. The deed, her uncle had written in a shaky hand at the bottom of his accompanying letter, was either a gift or a joke, and he was no longer certain which. He had filed on the land 6 years prior in a moment of high optimism, broken the sod, found the clay beneath the grass to be almost entirely impermeable, and given up inside of 18 months. He had paid his taxes on it faithfully, however, out of a stubborn pride that would not let him surrender it to the county, and so it had passed to Cora, clean and legal, 40 acres of documented failure on the north end of the Harlan Flats, 3 miles from the town of Greele. Cora was 22 years old. She had no family left to speak of, no income, and $51 in savings from 4 years of seamstress work in Topeka. She had, in lieu of prospects, an exceptional quality of attention. She noticed things. It was, for a long time, the only capital she had. The town of Greele delivered its verdict on Cora Vass inside of a week. It was not a cruel town, exactly. It was a tired town, a town that had watched too many hopeful people arrive and then leave thinner, and its wariness had curdled over the years into a kind of reflexive discouragement that it dispensed the way another town might dispense welcome. Hester Drum, who ran the dry goods and knew everything that moved through the county, said it plainly to the woman beside her at the counter while Cora was still in earshot buying a paper of nails. A young woman alone could not work 40 acres of flat clay, she said, and even if she could, the land was not workable. Everyone who had tried had said so. Howard Vass had said so himself, and a girl from Topeka who had never farmed a day in her life would discover it faster than most. Cora did not turn around. She counted her change, pocketed the nails, and walked out into the white spring light. Being right, she had already found, was its own kind of reply. It just took longer. She spent the first weeks learning the land the way you learn a difficult person, with patience and without assumption. She walked it in the early morning, when the angle of the light was low enough to show her the small variations in the ground she would have missed at noon. She walked it in the evening. She got on her knees and dug in the clay with her hands and with a borrowed post-hole auger in 6 different spots, and she laid out what she found in her head like a map. The clay was real. It ran deep in most places, a dense orange-gray layer that shed water rather than drinking it, which was why the surface cracked and nothing rooted well. But in the far southwest corner, the corner everyone had pointed to as the worst, the layer thinned. She felt it with the auger at 18 inches where everywhere else she hit it at 8. Below it, the soil changed. It was darker. It was, against all expectation, damp, not wet. not flooded, damp the way a room is damp when there is water somewhere inside the walls. She pulled the auger out and held the soil on the tip of it up to the light, and she smelled it, the good black smell of earth with a living thing below it. And she kept that fact quiet inside herself like a coal banked low under ash. It was old Pyotr Halash who helped her understand what she was smelling. Pyotr was 61 years old, a Hungarian immigrant, who had farmed the section east of hers for 11 years and who had survived things on that land that most men would not have survived. And he had survived them because he had a quality very similar to Cora's. He paid attention to what the land was actually saying rather than what he wished it would say. He had watched Cora walking her property in the early mornings from across the fence, not with suspicion but with something closer to professional interest, and one April morning he brought 2 cups of coffee to the fence line and handed one through the wire without ceremony, as if this were something they had arranged. He was a small, lean man with a white mustache and the look of someone who had compressed a great deal of difficulty into a very tidy package. "The land speaks," he said to her that morning, "but it speaks quietly, and most people are too busy arguing with it to hear." He had once found water on his east quarter by watching where the meadowlarks gathered in the evening, not near water, above it. He tapped the fence post. "Below this whole flat," he said, "there are old channels, old beds. The drought takes the surface water, but it cannot take the deep water because the deep water does not know it is a drought year. It has been moving since before there were people here to name it." Cora told him what she had found in the southwest corner, the thinning clay, the dark damp soil below 18 inches. Pyotr was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That corner is not the worst of the land. It is the best of it. It is the only place where the land is telling you the truth." She spent the summer of 1887 doing what she could with what she had, which was not much, but was more than nothing. She planted a kitchen garden in the southwest corner, digging down past the clay layer and mounding the darker soil up into rough beds. She built a fence from scavenged wire and cedar posts. She split herself. She put in beans and squash and a small stand of sorghum, and she hauled water by bucket from the creek a quarter-mile east on Pyotr's land, until he told her to simply cut a channel and use his water right, which she would pay back when she had something to pay back with. She kept that debt in a small notebook, exact to the penny, the way she kept everything exact. The garden grew. It grew better than she had a right to expect, given the summer was dry and the heat sat on the flats like a lid. The squash alone would have impressed a farmer with decent ground. Cora took a basket of it to the Greele market in August and sold it all inside of 90 minutes and came home with $4.20 and the knowledge that the ground in her southwest corner was substantially more productive than it had any business being, given that the county was in its second dry year and everyone else's gardens were producing half their normal yields. She told no one this. She put the $4.20 in her notebook, and she thought about the winter and about the spring after that, and about what to do next. What she arrived at, over the long quiet of that first winter, was pigs. It was not an obvious answer. Pigs required feed, and feed cost money she did not have in any surplus. Pigs required handling, and she had no experience with them beyond what she had observed on other people's farms. Pigs had a reputation in Harlan County as a second-rate enterprise, the thing you kept if you could not afford cattle, the thing you fed on slop and regret. When Cora mentioned to Hester Drum, carefully and without revealing her reasoning, that she was considering pigs, Hester Drum looked at her the way you look at someone who has just said something both wrong and a little sad. Hogs on that clay ground, Hester said, would root up nothing but their own misery. They needed mast and mud and running water, and the Voss ground had none of those things, and 40 acres could not support a meaningful number, 1 or 2 for the table maybe. But Cora Voss was alone, and a woman alone did not need a herd of hogs. She needed, Hester did not quite say, but implied with considerable precision, to find a different situation. Cora thanked her for the opinion, bought her flour and her salt, and walked home in the cold thinking about the dark, damp soil below 18 inches in her southwest corner and about the way pigs root. This was the quality of attention that separated Cora from the people who told her what she could not do. They looked at pigs and saw pigs. She looked at pigs and saw excavation equipment. She had read, in an agricultural circular she had borrowed from the small collection at the Greele post office, that hogs would root to depths of up to 2 feet, following moisture and the small organisms that gathered around it, that they could, in loose or sandy subsoil, open ground in a season that would take a man with a team and a turning plow 3 seasons to reach, that in certain conditions they would find water that no surface survey had indicated. The circular had called this a nuisance and a hazard and a cause of property damage in improved pastures, and Cora had read it and thought that on her specific 40 acres of documented failure, nuisance and hazard and property damage was exactly what she was hoping for. She did the arithmetic in the February dark, sitting with her candle and her notebook, and the numbers came to this. If she could direct the rooting of a significant number of hogs across her southwest corner over a period of 1 to 2 years, she might open the subsoil enough to let whatever moisture was moving below that clay layer reach the surface. She might, in effect, use the pigs to dig a slow well, or not a well, something older than a well. She wrote the word in her notebook and underlined it twice. Channel. The Shoats became available in late September of 1889. A man named Birch Corley, who ran a mediocre operation 12 miles west of Greele, had a disease move through his breeding herd that spring, not fatal, but reducing, the kind of illness that costs a herd its condition over months and leaves the animals thin and rough-coated and worth almost nothing at the fall sale. He had 48 young Shoats, 6 to 8 months old, that had escaped the disease but had not escaped the consequences of it, being small and underfed and generally unprepossessing, and he wanted them off his hands before winter because he could not afford to carry them through on diminished feed. He brought them to the Greele sale yard on the first Friday of October, and the sale yard looked at them and offered him 60 cents a head, $28.80 for 48 animals. Birch Corley, who was a proud man even when he had no particular cause to be, refused. He walked them back to his wagon. Cora, who had been at the yard to price feed, watched this happen. She followed Corley to his wagon, and she offered him $15 for all 48. He turned and looked at her with an expression that mixed insult and desperation in roughly equal proportions. She met his eyes and waited. $15, and I take them today, she said, and you are home for supper without the burden of feeding them another night. He took the money. The town saw the Shoats go down the Greele road toward the Voss place on the North Flat, and the town laughed. Not cruelly, not all of it anyway. But a young woman alone driving 48 ragged, thin-ribbed Shoats worth less than 32 cents apiece down a county road toward 40 acres of cracked clay that had never produced anything of value was an image that confirmed what most of Greele had suspected since the spring of 1887. The Voss woman was not going to make it. She was a kind enough person, and she worked hard enough, and it was a shame, really. But the land was what it was, and some people were simply not suited to the life they had chosen. Hester Drum said this at the counter of the dry goods that same afternoon, and 3 people nodded, and not one of them was wrong about the facts as they understood them. They were only wrong about what the facts meant. Cora spent October and November directing the hogs with systematic purpose, moving them across the southwest corner in a slow progression she had staked out with wooden markers, a grid she had laid by measuring and string the previous spring in anticipation of this. She supplemented their grazing with ground sorghum from her own crop and with the waste from the Greele mill, which she hauled twice a week in the wagon. Pyotr came over on a cold Saturday in November and watched her work for a long time without speaking, and then said she was doing it right, moving them just far enough each day that they were always working new ground, never content to wallow in what they had already opened. The earth, he said, does not give its best to a creature that stays in one place. Cora wrote this in her notebook. She had begun writing down the things Pyotr said because they tended to be correct. By the end of November, the southwest corner looked like a battlefield. The clay surface was broken and upturned across nearly 3 acres, the pale orange subsoil mixed with the darker layer below in rough, uneven windrows. The hogs were visibly better than they had arrived. Their ribs were disappearing under new condition. Their coats were thickening with the cold, and they moved with an authority they had not possessed in October. Cora walked the broken ground every morning. On the 23rd of November, the morning after the first hard freeze, she found the spot. In the center of the opened section, in a low place the hogs had worked deepest, there was a seep. It was not dramatic. It was not a spring. It was a slow, dark welling of moisture from below the clay, no bigger than her 2 hands laid flat, but steady. Steady in a way that surface moisture was not steady, in a way that said it was not leftover rain or snowmelt, but something coming from a moving source below. She stood over it in the gray morning and the cold, and she felt something she rarely let herself feel, which was certainty. She had been right. The channel was there. She told Pyotr. She did not tell anyone else. Pyotr came and looked at it, and got down on his knees in the cold mud and pressed his palm against the seep and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Now you widen it. You do not tell the town. You widen it, and you give the hogs the whole southwest quarter, and by spring you will know what you have." He did not say it with excitement. He said it the way a man states the next step in a sequence he has understood since the beginning. Cora nodded. She went home and opened her notebook and did the arithmetic for the winter ahead. The winter of 1889 going into 1890 was a hard one across the Harlan Flats. The cold came in December and stayed, and with it came the kind of dry that follows a dry year rather than ending it. The creek on Pyotr's east quarter dropped to a trickle by February and froze over in the last week of the month. 3 families on the north end of the flat lost their cattle tanks to ice and mud and had to haul water by wagon from town. Cora's hogs were drinking from the seep. By February, it had widened under their continued working to a low pool, 5 or 6 feet across, never more than a few inches deep, but always replenishing, always cold and clear, in a way that standing water was not. She had ringed it with flat stones to keep the edges from collapsing back into the hog's work, and she had begun, with Pyotr's guidance, to direct a shallow channel from the pool north and east across the cleared section. The hogs helped. They seemed to understand the water in the ground the way a compass understands north, orienting to it without instruction, following the trace of moisture through the subsoil with their long snouts in a systematic way that was almost architectural. By March the pool had widened to nearly 12 feet, and the channel they had cut northeast was running a thin, persistent trickle. Cora stood at the edge of it one morning in the first real warmth of early spring and listened to the sound it made, which was a small sound, barely audible, but real, water moving over stone. She had not heard that on her property before. She had 48 hogs that had arrived at 31 cents apiece and were now animals of real substance and value, and she had a moving water source on land that every surveyor and farmer and dry goods proprietor in Harlan County had judged incapable of supporting water, and she had done it with a $15 investment and 1 winter's work. She did not tell the town. There was still more to be done, and the town's attention was never something she had wanted before it was useful. April brought a man named Gerard Sills to Greele, and Gerard Sills was the problem that had been coming since before Cora arrived. He represented the Western Advancement Land and Livestock Company, which was the kind of name that covered a great many kinds of pressure and what he was doing in Greele specifically was locating distressed or marginal landholdings that could be acquired cheaply, consolidated, and sold on to a cattle operation he represented, whose name he did not make clear. He was a smooth man with good boots and a pleasant face that he used the way a tool is used, putting it on and taking it off with efficiency. He called on Cora at her farm on a Wednesday morning, hat in hand and boots clean, and told her that he had heard good things about her persistence on a difficult piece of land, and that he wanted to make her an offer that would reward her hard work fairly and relieve her of the burden of working alone. He named a number. It was $200 for the 40 acres, which was above the county's assessed value for the land by $40, and would have seemed generous to anyone who did not know what was in the southwest corner. Cora offered him coffee. She listened. She said she would think about it. He said he hoped she would think quickly, as his client's window for acquisition in this area was limited, and a young woman alone carrying a place like this through another dry summer was a prospect he would not wish on anyone. He said it gently, with what appeared to be concern. She thanked him for his concern and walked him to his horse. She went to Pyotr that afternoon. Pyotr listened and then cut 2 slices of bread and put one in front of her and said nothing for a while. Then he asked how Sills had known the county assessed value. Cora stopped with the bread halfway to her mouth. Pyotr nodded. "Tax records are public," he said, "but a man passing through to make a quick offer does not usually go to the trouble of pulling them unless he already knows something about the property he is looking at that makes the trouble worthwhile. He knows what you have found, or he suspects it. He has been asking questions. $200 for a water source on the Harlan Flats in a dry year," Pyotr said, "is the kind of offer that tells you more about what a thing is worth than a week of surveying would." Cora finished her bread and walked home and opened her notebook. She spent 2 weeks in May doing what the notebook told her to do. She finished the channel northeast with Pyotr's help, widening it with spade, and the continuing work of the hogs until it was running 6 to 8 inches wide and steady. She put in a rough head gate of flat stones that she could open or close. She measured the flow at 3 different hours of the day across 5 days and calculated a daily yield. Then she wrote a letter to a man named Archibald Pruitt in the county seat, whom Pyotr had known for a decade and described as a lawyer of the old honest school who still believed a deed was a sacred document and a water right was a serious matter. She described what she had and asked 2 questions: what was required under Kansas law to file a water right on a subsurface channel brought to surface through the holder's own improvement, and what was a reasonable per-acre valuation of irrigated land versus dry in Harlan County as of spring 1890. Pruitt wrote back in 8 days. The answers to both questions were useful. She copied them into her notebook in her careful hand, and then sat with them for a long time in the evening light. June arrived, and with it Sills again, this time with his pleasant face arranged in a slightly less pleasant configuration, and his offer raised by $50 to $250. Cora told him she had filed a water right on the southwest quarter of her property. She said it quietly and without drama. She watched his face. The pleasantness did not go out of it entirely, but it rearranged itself into something that was calculating rather than warm. He told her, still genially, that a water right on an unverified subsurface channel was a complicated thing and might not survive a legal examination, and that his company had resources to pursue such examinations at length, and that the complications involved might be considerable for a person without means to sustain them. Cora looked at him for a moment. Then she said she had verified the channel, that the flow was documented at 3 measurement points, that Archibald Pruitt had been retained and had reviewed the filing, and that the assessed value of irrigated acreage in Harlan County currently ran between $9 and $12 per acre. She had 40 acres. Sills looked at the woman in front of him, who was 25 years old and wore a calico dress mended twice at the elbows, and spoke these facts in the same tone one might read a recipe. And she could see him working through the arithmetic and arriving at the conclusion that he had badly misjudged this particular situation. He said he might be able to go to 300. Cora shook her head. She did not explain further. He left, and he did not come back. The land company turned its attention to other properties on the flat, and 2 of those properties sold to them inside of the year. And both of those transactions were ones those families would regret by 1892, but that is a different story. The summer of 1890 was the 3rd dry year in a row, and it was the worst of the 3. August arrived like the open door of a furnace and stayed that way into September. The creek on Pyotr's east quarter went dry for the first time in his 11 years on the property. The town of Greil watched its water situation with a fear it had been practicing for since the spring, and the fear did not improve on familiarity. The cattle on the flats were pulled to market early at poor prices because their owners could not water them. 3 more families sold, 2 of them to the land company and 1 to a relative in Salina. It was a reducing summer, the kind that took stock in people both and left what remained thinner and more careful. Cora Voss's hogs were drinking from a pool that had, over the course of 18 months of systematic rooting and channeling, expanded to nearly 40 feet across in the southwest corner and was still replenishing daily. She had, in addition, directed the channel northeast to serve a second garden plot of nearly an acre, which in the 3rd dry summer was producing green and extraordinary things that no one in Greil could quite account for. Word travels in a small county, even word that no one quite believes. It was Denny Polk who came first, though he would not have said he was asking for help. He was a neighbor 2 sections east who had 3 children and a wife and a beef herd that was running out of water. He came in the first week of August with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that a proud man wears when he has run out of choices, and he asked if the talk about water on the vast place was true. Cora showed him the pool and the channel and the garden. He stood and looked at them for a long time. He said he didn't know how she'd managed it. She said it was the pigs mostly, and the ground, and she named Pyotr Halash, who had taught her to listen to the land. Polk looked at the water for another long moment, and then asked what she wanted for watering rights. Cora thought about Gerard Sills and his pleasant face, and his $200 offer. She thought about the arithmetic of a summer like this one, and what it meant to a man with 3 children. She named a price in labor, 2 weeks of his time or his son's time in the fall, helping to extend the channel another quarter-mile northeast, where she believed the source would support it. Polk looked at her and then back at the water and nodded. They shook hands on it. The word moved through the county the way word moves when people are frightened, fast and not entirely accurate, but fast. By the 2nd week of August 4, more families had spoken to Cora about the water, and she had worked out arrangements with 3 of them, all in labor or in kind, rather than cash, because she did not want the cash as much as she wanted the channel extended and the next season's planting prepared. Hester Drum came on a Thursday morning, which surprised Cora more than any of the others. She did not come as Hester Drum of the dry goods with her settled opinions. She came as a woman whose family had a kitchen garden going brown, and a milk cow that was refusing the little water left in its tank. She stood at the edge of Cora's pool and looked at it, and then she looked at Cora. And she did not say she had been wrong exactly, but she said she had not expected this. Nobody had. Cora didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. She offered the woman water for her cow and her garden, and the price of it was a fair one, and Hester Drum paid it without argument. The hogs, for their part, had become the other half of the story. The 48 shoats that Cora had paid 31 cents apiece for in October of 1889 had grown into substantial animals over 3 seasons of food and water and systematic work, and she had bred the best 20 of them, and was carrying a second generation that was already superior to anything Birch Corley had ever brought to the Greele sale yard. In September of 1890, she drove 14 finished hogs to the yard, not the thin, rough-coated animals she had bought, but heavy, even, well-muscled animals that the yard's buyer looked at with an attention that was different in kind from the attention he had given the Shoats the previous year. He walked around them twice. He asked where they'd been raised. Cora told him on the North Flat, and he told her that was not possible, because nothing that finished that well had ever come off the North Flat. And she told him she was standing there in front of him, and so were the hogs, and he could make of that what he liked. He offered her $3 a head. She said $4. He said $3.50. She said she would take them home and sell them direct to the hotel kitchen in Greele, and she turned for the gate. He said $4. She took it. $56 for 14 hogs that had cost her roughly $4.40 to raise from their share of the original purchase. She did not show the arithmetic to anyone. She went home and wrote it in her notebook, and then she sat with it for a while and felt the thing she almost never let herself feel, which was peace. It was the boy, Tommy Polk, who named them. He was Denny Polk's 11-year-old son, and he had been coming to the Vass farm 3 days a week through the late summer as part of his father's labor arrangement, and he had attached himself to the hog operation with the single-minded devotion that certain children give to certain animals in the way of a vocation rather than a hobby. He moved through the herd without fear, and the hogs moved for him in a way they did not always move for adults. And Cora had given him more and more responsibility over the feeding rotation until he was managing it with a competence she did not have to supervise. He named all 63 of the remaining hogs. He named them from a system she could not entirely decode, but which he maintained with absolute consistency, and he could locate any one of them in the herd by name in less than a minute, which was a practical skill, however amusing it was in principle. Cora asked him once how he kept track of all 63. He looked at her with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing. "You just know them," he said, "like people." She thought about that for a while. There was something in it that applied to the land as well. You just knew it, if you paid attention, if you stayed. By the third week of September 1890, the channel northeast was running nearly a quarter mile in the direction Cora had predicted, fed by the pool in the southwest corner that was itself fed by the underground movement of water that the Drought had not stopped because it ran too deep for Drought to reach it. Pyotr walked the channel with her that morning, slowly, stopping to look at the flow at each measurement point she had set. He was older by 3 years than when he had handed coffee through the fence, and told her the land spoke quietly, and he walked slower than he had. But he looked at the water moving over the flat stones with an expression that was close to happiness. "You widened it," he said. "That was the whole of it. You widened what was already there." He said it in the tone of a lesson completed, a thing taught and then done. Cora thought about what he had said in the beginning, at the fence in the cold April morning 3 years prior. The land speaks, but it speaks quietly. She had widened that too, she thought, her ability to hear it. The reckoning with Sills came in October of 1890, not through any dramatic confrontation, but through the quieter mechanism of public record, which is often more effective. Archibald Pruitt, in the course of reviewing the land company's acquisitions in Harlan County, identified an irregularity in 2 of the deeds Sills had recorded, a discrepancy in the survey boundaries that had the effect of adding a few acres from each adjacent parcel to the company's holdings, not by outright fraud, but by the kind of paperwork error that benefits one party consistently and in the same direction, which is the kind of error that stops being an error after the second time it happens. Pruitt brought this to the county surveyor, and the county surveyor brought it to the land commission, and the land company's holdings were resurveyed, and 2 of the sold properties were partially restored, which was not a complete remedy, but was a public one, and Sills's name in Harlan County was thereafter associated with the kind of paperwork that bears watching, which was its own useful outcome. He had come to Greil looking for a young woman alone who would be grateful for $200 and a way out. He had left with a water right, filed against his company's ambitions and a reputation that preceded him on his next assignment. The land had its own arithmetic, and it was accurate. Cora went to the Greil market on the last Saturday of October with a wagon of goods that people stopped to look at the way they stopped to look at things that did not belong in the landscape they thought they knew. There were late-season vegetables out of the northeast garden that should not have been possible in a drought year. Squash and turnips and 3 varieties of bean and a quantity of dry corn that was fat-kerneled and even in a way that the drought-year corn from other farms was not. There were eggs from 12 hens she had added to the operation in the spring, and there were 2 hogs, live and finished, that she was offering at $4.25 a head, which was above the sale yard rate and which 2 separate buyers accepted inside of 20 minutes because the quality was visible to anyone who looked. She set up her table, and she sold what she had, and people came to the table and bought. And some of them were people who had nodded at the counter of the dry goods in 1887 when Hester Drum had explained why a young woman alone could not work 40 acres of clay. They bought her turnips and her corn, and they did not meet her eyes, and she did not require them to. She had not done any of it to be looked at. She had done it because the land had told her something true and she had listened, and because she had paid $15 for 48 starving shoats when the arithmetic told her she should, and because she had kept her coal banked low under ash until it was ready to give heat. Pyotr found her at the end of the market day when she was loading the empty boxes back into the wagon, and he helped her with the last 2 without asking, and then stood at the wagon's tailgate and looked at her with the expression he sometimes had, of a man reviewing a sum that comes out right. He said to her what he had said at the fence 3 years before, not because he had forgotten he had said it, but because it had earned the saying twice. The land speaks, but it speaks quietly. Most people are too busy arguing with it to hear. Cora put the last box in the wagon and looked at the October sky, which was the high, thin blue of a Kansas autumn, and thought about the water moving below the flat, moving the way it had always moved, deep and patient and indifferent to the year's men named Dry. She thought about 48 Shoats who had gone to the worst corner of the property as if they knew. She thought about the boy Tommy Polk, who knew 63 pigs by name, and Denny Polk, who had come with his hat in his hands and gone home with water for his children, and Hester Drum, who had stood at the edge of the pool and said she had not expected this. She thought about the notebook in the house with its careful columns of numbers and its underlined word, channel. She thought about all of it, and then she climbed up onto the wagon seat and lifted the reins, and the horse moved forward on the rutted October road, and behind her, on the 40 acres of documented failure, the water ran on, and the hogs moved in the early dusk. And the land said the one true thing it had always been saying, quietly, to anyone who had learned to hear it.